It was a stormy night, the kind that makes people turn a blind eye to strangers in need. But not Jake. He slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding as he spotted a lone figure drenched on the side of the road. A woman, soaked, shivering, and desperately waving for help. He didn't know it yet, but the decision he made in that moment would change his life forever. Because the woman he was about to save was no ordinary traveler. She was a billionaire CEO, and fate had just handed him the biggest opportunity of his life. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The highway stretched before him, a slick ribbon of asphalt barely visible under the hammering rain. Wind howled through the cab of Jake's 18-wheeler, shaking the rig with every brutal gust. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his breath steady despite the chaos outside. He had driven through worse, snowstorms, dust storms, even the occasional tornado warning, but tonight something about the storm felt different, unsettling. His dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, sharp with urgency. "Jake, you got an ETA on that drop? Client's already breathing down my neck." Jake exhaled, shifting gears as he maneuvered through the sheets of water cascading down the windshield. "I'm pushing as hard as I can. This storm's a beast." "Yeah, well, you're 3 hours behind schedule. Just get it done." The radio cut out. Jake shook his head, muttering under his breath. It was always the same. Numbers, deadlines, urgency. No one cared about the guy behind the wheel, the one gripping that massive machine through conditions that could flip him in an instant. The road ahead was a blur, streetlights flickering like dying embers. The wipers struggled to keep up, but nothing could cut through the torrential downpour. The weight of the load in his trailer made every movement sluggish, every turn a calculated risk. One wrong move, and he'd be jackknifed across the asphalt, another cautionary tale for truckers running against the clock. Lightning split the sky, revealing the towering silhouette of trees flanking the highway. For a moment everything was illuminated, the deserted road, the endless storm, the exhaustion settling deep into his bones. Then darkness swallowed it all again. He adjusted in his seat, rolling his shoulders. He just had to get through the night. A few more hours, a quick drop-off, and he'd be back on the road, away from the deadlines, away from the ungrateful clients who saw him as nothing more than a cog in their machine. Then, out of nowhere, something flickered in his peripheral vision, a shadow on the side of the road. At first he thought it was nothing, a trick of the rain, a stray branch whipping in the wind. But then it moved. A person. Jake's pulse spiked. Who in their right mind would be out in a storm like this? He squinted through the downpour, catching the faint glow of a cell phone screen as it flickered off. Whoever they weren't just walking, they were stranded. His gut clenched. He didn't have time for this. He barely had time for himself. But as his foot hovered over the gas pedal, the truck roaring beneath him, a voice in the back of his mind whispered the question he couldn't ignore. If it were you, wouldn't you want someone to stop? Cursing under his breath, Jake slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded slightly as Jake fought the wheel, forcing the 18-wheeler to a grinding halt on the shoulder of the highway. Rain slammed against the windshield in sheets, and the wipers fought a losing battle against the relentless downpour. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, his breath steady but edged with adrenaline. He squinted through the storm. There, just a few feet ahead, stood the lone figure, barely visible in the dim glow of his headlights. A woman soaked to the bone, her clothes clinging to her like a second skin, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. And even from inside the cab, Jake could see the way she shivered. Her car sat motionless beside her, hazards flickering weakly, the engine dead. He ran a hand through his damp hair, exhaling sharply. This was a bad idea. Every instinct in his body told him to keep driving. This wasn't his problem. Truckers had rules about this sort of thing. Don't pick up strangers. Don't stop in the middle of nowhere, especially in a storm. But something about the way she stood there, helpless against the brutal rain, sent a sharp pang through his chest. She was trying to wave, but her movements were sluggish, exhausted. like she had been out there for a while, too long. Jake threw the truck into park, flicked on his hazards, and reached for the door handle. The second he stepped out, the wind hit him like a freight train, rain lashing against his face, soaking through his jacket within seconds. The woman's eyes widened as he approached, her lips trembling. "Oh, thank God," she gasped, hugging herself tighter. I didn't think anyone would stop." Her voice was raw, strained. She had been yelling for help, probably for hours. Jake's stomach turned at the thought. "Car breakdown?" he asked, raising his voice to be heard over the wind. She nodded quickly. "It just died. No warning. My phone's dead. I've been stuck here for—" Her voice cracked and she pressed her lips together. Jake sighed, glancing at the lifeless sedan. It wasn't going anywhere tonight. That much was clear. He looked back at her. Her thin blouse was plastered to her skin, her hair dripping. She was freezing. "Come on," he said, jerking his head toward his truck. "You can't stay out here." She hesitated, and for a second he saw something flicker in her eyes, uncertainty, maybe even fear. He couldn't blame her. A strange man offering her a ride in the middle of a storm? Yeah, he'd be wary too. "I get it," he said, softening his tone. "You don't know me, but you'll freeze to death out here, and I don't think another car's coming any time soon." She looked at the empty road behind her, then back at him. Another gust of wind hit, and her whole body shuddered. Finally, she swallowed hard and nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Jake didn't waste another second. He led her back to the truck, the storm raging around them, unaware that this single act of kindness was about to change his life forever. Jake clenched his jaw as he watched the woman hesitate by the side of the road, drenched, shivering, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. His fingers flexed on the steering wheel, every muscle in his body urging him to just keep driving. He had deadlines. He had a job. Stopping in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a damn storm. This was breaking every rule in the book. Truckers didn't stop for stranded strangers. It wasn't just about safety. It was survival. People had been set up, robbed, even killed for less. And if something happened, no one would be out here to help him. But then he looked at her again, the way she trembled, her shoulders tight with exhaustion. The way the rain had beaten her down, making her look small, lost, desperate. He muttered a curse under his breath. The seconds stretched. The sound of the rain hammering against the windshield filled the cab. His dispatcher's voice crackled in his head, reminding him that he was already behind. But another voice, one deeper, older, from a time when he still believed the world was good, spoke louder. "If it were you, wouldn't you want someone to stop?" His foot moved before his mind could talk him out of it. The hiss of the air brakes cut through the storm as the massive truck lurched to a stop. For a beat, she didn't move, like she couldn't believe someone had actually pulled over. Then she stumbled forward, arms waving, relief flashing in her eyes. Jake grabbed his flashlight and pushed the door open. The moment he stepped out, the wind slammed into him, sending a shock of cold through his soaked shirt. Rain pelted his face, sharp like needles. "Car breakdown?" he called over the storm. She nodded frantically, her wet hair sticking to her cheeks. "It just died. No signal. No one stopped." Her voice cracked, and Jake felt something twist in his chest. He knew that feeling, the helplessness, the anger of being abandoned by a world too busy to care. He could still walk away, still climb back into his truck, pretend he never saw her. But he wouldn't. Not tonight. Not ever. "Come on," he said, jerking his head toward the truck. "You're getting out of this rain." Jake cranked up the heat as the truck rumbled back onto the highway, the rain still lashing against the windshield in relentless waves. The cab was silent except for the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the faint hum of the engine beneath them. Beside him, the woman, Eleanor, she had introduced herself, sat stiffly, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were still trying to ward off the cold that had seeped into her bones. "Thanks again," she murmured, after a long stretch of silence, "for stopping." Jake flicked her a glance, noting the way her hands trembled slightly, whether from the cold or nerves he wasn't sure. "Not a problem," he said simply. But it was a problem. His delivery was late. He was behind schedule. And if his dispatcher found out he'd picked up a stranger in the middle of nowhere, there'd be hell to pay. He glanced at her again. She wasn't dressed for a storm like this. No coat, no proper gear. Her dark blouse and slacks clung to her, the damp fabric evidence that she'd been out in the rain far too long. "You live around here?" he asked, breaking the quiet. She hesitated, just for a second, before shaking her head. "No, just passing through." That pause was enough for Jake to pick up on something. Most people stranded on the side of the road would be relieved to make conversation, eager to explain their situation. Eleanor, though, was careful with her words, guarded. "Where were you headed?" "Nowhere specific." Another vague answer. Jake's grip tightened on the wheel. People didn't just break down in the middle of a storm going nowhere. "Where do you want me to drop you off?" She stared out the rain-streaked window. "Anywhere safe." There it was again, that hesitation, the careful avoidance of details. Jake had been around enough people to know when someone was holding something back, and Eleanor was definitely holding something back. He didn't press her, but something about this situation didn't sit right. A woman alone in the middle of a storm, with a car that just happens to die and a phone that just happens to be dead too? Yeah, he wasn't buying it. "All right," he finally said. "I'll get you to the next truck stop. You can get a tow from there." She exhaled, almost as if in relief, and nodded. "Thank you, Jake." She knew his name. He never told her his name. His eyes flicked toward her, but she just stared straight ahead, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Jake tightened his grip on the wheel. Something told him this wasn't just some ordinary stranded traveler. The road stretched ahead in an endless ribbon of black, slick with rain, the headlights carving a lonely path through the storm. Inside the cab, the warmth of the heater had finally started to push back the lingering cold, but the air between them remained heavy with unspoken things. Jake kept his eyes on the road, his fingers tight around the wheel. Eleanor sat beside him, silent but awake, her gaze fixed on the blur of trees and highway lines flashing past the window. She hadn't said much since she'd climbed into his truck, and Jake wasn't the kind of man to pry. But something about the way she carried herself, the careful way she measured her words, made him wonder what kind of mess she was running from. He let out a slow breath. "You travel a lot?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. Eleanor turned toward him, the low dashboard light casting soft shadows across her face. "Yeah," she said after a pause. "I guess you could say that." Something about the way she answered made Jake think it wasn't by choice. He nodded, letting the silence settle again before speaking. "I do too. Been on the road most of my life. My old man was a trucker. Grew up watching him go town to town, always moving, never staying in one place too long." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, interested. "And you followed in his footsteps?" Jake let out a dry chuckle. "Not at first. Thought I'd be different. I tried college, did a couple years, but tuition bled me dry. Then my mom got sick, and bills started piling up. Trucking paid, so here I am." She didn't say anything right away, just watched him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Do you like it?" she finally asked. Jake exhaled, tapping his fingers against the wheel. "Some days, yeah. I like the open road, the quiet. But it's a grind, the long hours, the way companies treat guys like me, like we're disposable. I missed a day once when my mom passed. They docked my pay." His jaw tightened. "Never let me forget it either." Eleanor shifted in her seat. "That's awful." He shrugged. "It's life." For a while, neither of them spoke. The storm had started to ease, the heavy downpour fading into a steady rhythm against the windshield. Then Eleanor broke the silence. "You ever think about doing something else?" Jake let out a soft laugh. "Sure, but guys like me don't get many chances. The world doesn't make it easy to start over." He felt her watching him, but when he turned to meet her gaze, she quickly looked away. She knew something about second chances. That much he was sure of. But whatever her story was, she wasn't ready to tell it. Not yet. The storm had eased into a steady drizzle by the time they approached the outskirts of the next town. The highway lights cast a dim yellow glow over the wet pavement, reflecting off the rain-slicked roads like pools of molten gold. Jake had expected Eleanor to ask him to drop her off at a gas station, or maybe a small diner, somewhere she could make a call and figure things out. But when she finally spoke, her request caught him off guard. "There's a hotel a few miles up," she said, her voice even but careful. "Could you drop me there?" Jake glanced at her, his grip tightening slightly on the wheel. "Hotel, huh?" She nodded, her hands resting in her lap, fingers curled together. "Yeah, it's where I was heading before my car broke down." There was something too rehearsed about the way she said it, too precise. Jake didn't respond right away. Instead, he flicked his eyes toward the GPS mounted on his dashboard, pulling up the nearest hotels in the area. He expected to see the usual roadside motels, cheap, practical places where truckers and late-night travelers crashed for a few hours. But the one Eleanor was talking about, it was a 5-star luxury hotel. Jake scoffed under his breath. "That's a hell of a place to stay the night." Eleanor shifted in her seat. "I have a room booked there already." That was another lie. He didn't know how he knew, but he did. Maybe it was the way she said it, a little too quickly, like she was trying to fill the space before he could question it. Or maybe it was the fact that no one who booked rooms in places like that ended up stranded on the side of the road in a storm, wearing clothes that looked more like they belonged to someone running late for a business meeting than someone on a luxury vacation. Still, it wasn't his place to pry. "You got someone waiting for you there?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. For a split second, her expression changed. A flicker of something, hesitation, maybe even fear, before she masked it. "No, just me." Jake nodded, keeping his thoughts to himself. A billionaire's hotel, but a broken-down car. Clothes that screamed business professional, but no real destination. She had a story, that much was clear. And for the first time since picking her up, Jake was starting to wonder if stopping had been a mistake. Jake pulled into a rest stop just as the first light of dawn stretched across the sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind damp roads and a sky smeared with pale orange and gray. His body ached from the long drive, but he barely noticed. His mind was still stuck on last night, on the woman, Eleanor, and the way she had carefully avoided every question that got too close to the truth. He shook off the thoughts as he killed the engine and climbed out, stretching his stiff muscles. A hot cup of coffee was calling his name, and maybe a few hours of sleep before he got back on the road. But as he turned to grab his jacket from the passenger seat, something caught his eye. A small, sleek leather wallet, half tucked between the seat and the console. Jake frowned. He reached down, picking it up. The leather was smooth, expensive, not the kind of thing a person left behind unless they were distracted or in a hurry. His stomach tightened. Eleanor's. He flipped it open, expecting to find the usual: cash, credit cards, maybe a driver's license. But what he saw made his pulse kick up a notch. Platinum cards, not just one, but several. The kind with weight to them, the kind that people with real money carried. A business card, tucked neatly into one of the slots, with a name that made his brows lift. Eleanor Caldwell, CEO, Caldwell Logistics. Jake let out a low whistle. Logistics. Trucking. It hit him all at once. The expensive clothes, the hotel, the careful way she had measured every response, never giving too much away. He hadn't picked up some random stranded traveler. He had picked up one of the wealthiest businesswomen in the country. He sat there for a moment, turning the wallet over in his hands. She had said nothing about who she really was, not a single word. Jake exhaled sharply, tossing the wallet onto the dashboard. Well, now he had a choice to make. He could drive off and never think about her again. Or he could return it, and finally get some answers. Jake sat in his truck, the engine idling, the weight of Eleanor's wallet sitting heavy in his hands. His mind buzzed, still trying to process what he had just found. Eleanor Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Logistics. The name meant nothing to him at first, just words printed on an expensive business card. But those platinum credit cards, that hotel, the way she had been so careful with her words, it all added up to something bigger than a stranded woman in the rain. His fingers hovered over his phone. He didn't like digging into people's lives. It wasn't his business. But Eleanor hadn't just forgotten to mention who she was. She had hidden it. And that made him curious. With a sigh, he opened the search bar and typed her name. The screen lit up with articles, interviews, stock reports. And there she was, staring back at him in crisp corporate headshots, standing in front of glossy boardrooms, shaking hands with people in suits that probably cost more than his entire truck. Billionaire CEO Eleanor Caldwell expands her logistics empire, Caldwell Logistics Partners, with international shipping giants. Eleanor Caldwell, the woman who revolutionized freight and supply chains. Jake let out a slow breath, his pulse thrumming in his ears. Caldwell Logistics. He knew that name. Every trucker did. It was one of the biggest logistics firms in the country. Hell, the company she ran had probably handled half the shipments he had driven in the last 5 years. And yet, last night she had sat beside him, soaked to the bone, pretending to be just another unlucky traveler. His jaw clenched. Why would a woman worth billions be driving alone in a storm? Why lie about where she was headed? None of it made sense. He exhaled sharply, gripping the wallet. There was only one way to find out. He was going to return it. And this time, he wasn't leaving without answers. Jake pulled up in front of the luxury hotel, his truck, looking wildly out of place among the sleek sports cars and polished black sedans lining the entrance. The kind of vehicles driven by people who never had to worry about gas prices or overtime pay. People like Eleanor Caldwell. The thought left a bitter taste in his mouth. He should have just left the damn wallet at the front desk and gone on with his day. He was already behind on his deliveries. But something about this whole thing didn't sit right. The way she had hidden who she was, the way she had sat in his truck, cold and quiet, listening to his problems while keeping hers locked behind some invisible wall. He wasn't here for a reward. He wasn't here to play some game of cat and mouse with a billionaire. He was here because it was the right thing to do. Stepping out of the truck, he shut the door harder than necessary and strode toward the entrance, shaking off the rain that still clung to his jacket. The lobby was exactly what he expected. Marble floors that shone like glass, a chandelier so massive it looked like it could crush a man, and a receptionist who gave him a once-over like she was debating whether he had wandered in by mistake. "I'm looking for Eleanor Caldwell," Jake said, pulling the wallet from his pocket and holding it up. "She left this in my truck last night." The woman's expression barely shifted. "Ms. Caldwell isn't taking visitors." Jake exhaled sharply. Of course she wasn't. "Look," he said, his patience thinning. "I'm not here to bother her. Just give this to her, all right?" Before the receptionist could respond, a voice cut through the air. "Jake?" He turned. Eleanor stood at the top of the staircase leading to the lobby, dressed differently than last night, sleek, poised, polished, like she had stepped right out of one of those magazine articles he had read earlier. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then she made her way down the steps, stopping just inches from him. "You—" She glanced at the wallet in his hand, her expression unreadable. "You came back." Jake nodded. "Figured you'd need this." She took it, her fingers brushing against his. "You didn't have to." "Yeah," he said, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "I did." Eleanor studied him, something flickering in her gaze. Maybe surprise. Maybe something else. Jake didn't care. He had done his part. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward his truck. Jake had barely made it halfway to his truck when he heard her footsteps behind him. Light, quick, deliberate. "Wait!" Eleanor called. He could have kept walking. Should have. But something in her voice, something unspoken, something urgent, made him stop. He turned as she approached, the wallet clutched in her hand like she didn't know what to do with it now that it was back where it belonged. Gone was the shivering woman from the night before, the one standing in the storm with nothing but desperation in her eyes. This version of Eleanor was composed, controlled, every inch the powerful CEO he had read about. But there was something else too, something unsettled. "You didn't have to bring it back yourself," she said, searching his face. "You could have left it at the front desk." Jake shrugged. "Could have." Silence stretched between them. Eleanor exhaled, shifting the wallet to her other hand. "I appreciate it, really, and I'd like to thank you properly." Jake stiffened. He knew where this was going before she even said it. "I can wire you something," she continued. "A bonus, if you will, for your trouble." And there it was, the part he hated most. Jake's jaw tightened. "I don't need your money." Eleanor blinked, as if he had just spoken a language she didn't understand. "It's not about need. It's about fairness. You went out of your way to help me. Let me do something for you." "Already did," he said simply. "You said thanks. That's enough." She studied him, her head tilting just slightly, like she was trying to figure out what kind of person turned down a blank check. Jake had seen that look before, on people who had never gone hungry, never had to choose between rent and groceries, never worked themselves to the bone just to be treated like they were replaceable. They assumed money fixed everything, because for them, it always had. He took a step back. "Take care of yourself, Eleanor." For the second time that morning, he turned to leave, but this time, she didn't let him. "Jake." He stopped, exhaling through his nose. "There's something else I can give you," she said carefully. "Something more valuable than money." That made him turn. Eleanor met his eyes, and this time there was no hesitation. "I want to offer you a job." Jake let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "A job?" Eleanor didn't flinch. She held his gaze, calm, unreadable. "Yes." Jake rubbed the back of his neck, glancing toward his truck. He had woken up this morning expecting nothing more than another long haul, another exhausting stretch of road, another day of being just another nameless driver, moving goods for people who never thought twice about where their shipments came from. But now he was standing in the middle of a 5-star hotel lobby, staring at a woman who could buy this entire town if she wanted to, offering him something that didn't make a damn bit of sense. "You don't even know me," he said, arms crossed. "I know enough," Jake scoffed. "Yeah? And what's that?" Eleanor took a step closer. "You stopped in the middle of a storm for a stranger. You returned a wallet without expecting anything in return. And you're standing here now, turning down money because your integrity is worth more to you than a paycheck." She paused. "That tells me plenty." Jake shifted his weight, exhaling slowly. He didn't like the way her words settled in his chest, because deep down, he knew she wasn't wrong. "I don't belong in your world," he said. Eleanor's lips pressed together, a small, knowing smile, tugging at the corners. "You sure about that?" Jake glanced around, taking in the gleaming floors, the suited businessmen walking through the lobby with purpose, the kind of people who probably never even noticed guys like him. And then there was her, standing there like she belonged everywhere she went. He should have walked away. This wasn't his game, but damn it, he was curious. "What kind of job?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Eleanor studied him for a long moment before answering. "Come to my office tomorrow," she said. "Let's find out." She reached into her wallet, pulling out a sleek black card, and held it out to him. Jake hesitated. Then, slowly, he took it. Their fingers brushed for the briefest second before she pulled away. "I hope you show up," she said, then turned and walked away. Jake looked down at the card in his hand. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure which road he was supposed to take. Jake stepped into the towering glass building, the kind of place where even the air smelled expensive. The polished floors reflected the overhead lights, the hum of productivity filling the space as sharply dressed employees moved with purpose, eyes glued to their tablets and phones. He adjusted his jacket, suddenly feeling like every wrinkle in his worn flannel shirt stood out. He didn't belong here, and everyone in the damn place seemed to know it. A receptionist with a practiced smile barely glanced up as he approached the front desk. "Can I help you?" "Yeah," Jake said, clearing his throat. "I've got a meeting with Eleanor Caldwell." That got her attention. She blinked, eyes flicking over him, taking in the jeans, the calloused hands, the boots that had seen more miles than this entire building had probably existed. "Name?" she asked, tone skeptical. "Jake." She hesitated, clearly debating whether she should even bother looking, but when she did, her brows lifted slightly. "Ms. Caldwell is expecting you. Take the executive elevator to the top floor." Jake nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets as he made his way toward the elevator. He could feel the eyes on him, subtle, but there. A few suits whispering to each other, side eyes from men who had probably never worked a job where missing a single day meant missing rent. The elevator doors slid open, and he stepped inside, exhaling sharply as he leaned against the wall. What the hell was he doing here? The doors opened to an office floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. He had barely taken a step before a voice cut through the air. "You lost?" Jake turned. A man in a crisp navy suit, arms crossed, looking at him, like he had wandered in from a construction site. "No," Jake said evenly. "I've got a meeting with Eleanor." The man's lips twitched, something close to amusement flashing in his eyes. "Ms. Caldwell is in a meeting. You can wait." His gaze flicked over Jake's clothes. "Or I can tell her you changed your mind." Jake clenched his jaw. This place was exactly what he thought it'd be, full of people who measured a man by his suit, not his work. But he wasn't here for them, he was here for answers. So he met the man's stare, steady and unshaken. "I'll wait." Jake sat in the sleek leather chair outside Eleanor's office, arms crossed, his patience running thin. The receptionist had told him it wouldn't be long, but he'd been waiting close to 30 minutes, long enough to see more than a few suits glance his way, whispering behind their hands. They weren't subtle. They didn't have to be. He wasn't one of them, and they knew it. Finally, the heavy glass doors to Eleanor's office swung open. A group of men in tailored suits filed out, deep in discussion, their voices low and clipped. Jake caught a few words: numbers, expansion plans, revenue projections, a world away from the conversations he was used to. Then Eleanor appeared in the doorway, effortlessly composed, just like before. But this time, when she met his eyes, there was something different in her expression, a challenge. "Come in," she said. Jake stood, brushing off the judgment that clung to him like dust, and followed her inside. Her office was massive, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. He felt the weight of it all, the power, the wealth, the decisions made in this room that affected thousands of people. Eleanor leaned against her desk, arms folded. "You showed up." "You asked," Jake said simply. She studied him for a moment, then exhaled. "You know who I am now." "Figured it out." "And you still came." Jake's jaw tightened. "I don't back down easy." A small smile played at her lips. "Good. Because I didn't bring you here for a favor. I brought you here because I think you're worth something more than long hauls and company schedules that bleed drivers dry." Jake frowned. "What are you saying?" "I want to see what you can do," she said, pushing off the desk. "You know this industry better than half the people in this building. I want you to prove it." Jake arched a brow. "Prove it how?" Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "I'm giving you a challenge. You fix a problem no one else here can. If you do, there's a job waiting for you, a real one." Jake studied her, searching for the catch. There had to be one. Finally, he leaned forward. "All right," he said, "let's see what you've got." Jake stood in front of a massive conference table, feeling every pair of eyes in the room sizing him up. The air smelled like expensive coffee and polished ambition, but underneath it, he could sense something else: doubt. These weren't truckers, warehouse workers, or the kind of people who did the heavy lifting. These were executives, analysts, and career men in pressed suits who had never seen the inside of a loading dock, let alone spent nights on the road praying their brakes held up on a steep descent. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, calm, unreadable, but Jake could see it in her eyes. This wasn't just for show. She was testing him, and she wasn't about to make it easy. A man in glasses cleared his throat and pushed a file toward him. "Here's the problem," he said, his voice clipped. "One of our distribution hubs in Texas is completely backed up. Trucks aren't moving fast enough, routes are overlapping, and we're losing thousands by the hour. We've already had to issue partial refunds to clients." Jake flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning spreadsheets filled with numbers, metrics, and jargon that didn't mean much to him. He didn't need paperwork to tell him what was wrong. He had seen this before, lived it. "You've had delays before," Jake said, setting the file down. "Why's this one different?" The man adjusted his tie, clearly not used to being questioned. "Driver turnover is high. We can't keep them long enough to get shipments moving consistently," Jake scoffed. "Maybe that's because they're getting worked into the ground and barely making enough to keep their rigs running." The room went silent. One of the executives shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor, though, remained steady, watching, waiting. Jake leaned forward, planting his hands on the table. "You want to fix the problem? You don't start with the numbers. You start with the drivers. You're running routes that are too damn long, forcing guys to choose between sleep and making their deadlines. You've got distribution managers pushing out half-loaded trucks just to hit quotas, and I'd bet money you've got some office kid making route plans based on software instead of real road experience." One of the men scoffed. "And what would you suggest then?" Jake didn't blink. "Cut route redundancies, adjust schedules to avoid bottlenecks at major hubs, and stop treating your drivers like machines. You fix those three things, and you'll see movement before the week is out." A long silence followed. The executives glanced at one another, skeptical. Eleanor smiled. "Interesting," she said. "Let's see if you're right." Jake could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, the skeptical stares of men who had spent their lives in boardrooms, crunching numbers and making decisions from behind polished mahogany desks. He wasn't one of them, and they knew it. Hell, he felt it. The way they shifted uncomfortably whenever he spoke, the quick glances they exchanged like they were silently asking, "Why is this guy here?" But he wasn't going anywhere. Eleanor had given him a shot, and now he was standing in the heart of Caldwell Logistics, surrounded by people who thought he had no business being there. The real test wasn't fixing the problem. That part was easy. The real challenge was getting these people to listen. "You want to cut delays?" Jake said, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. "Then you need to stop treating drivers like disposable parts in your machine." A man in a dark gray suit, one of the senior executives, let out a quiet scoff. "We don't treat them that way." Jake let out a dry laugh. "You sure about that?" "Because out there, every trucker knows Caldwell Logistics pays just enough to keep them around, but not enough to make them stay. You want loyalty? Pay them like they matter. You want efficiency? Give them routes that don't have them running on fumes by the time they reach their drop." Another man, younger, with an MBA written all over his smug expression, cleared his throat. "Our data suggests that our route planning system is already optimized for efficiency." Jake shook his head. "Your data ever get stuck at a way station for 3 hours because the paperwork was off by one number? You ever sit in bumper-to-bumper traffic on I-10 at 2 in the morning knowing you're not going to make your deadline because some executive with data thought an overnight haul was a good idea?" Silence. Eleanor smirked, but she stayed quiet, letting him fight his own battles. The older executive finally sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right, Jake, you talk a big game. What's your plan?" Jake leaned forward. "You give me a week. I'll work with dispatch, the route planners, and, most importantly, the drivers. If I can't get those trucks moving, I'll walk out that door, no questions asked." The tension in the room shifted. The suits weren't convinced. But Eleanor? She was smiling. "All right," she said. "You've got 1 week." Jake had expected resistance, but he hadn't expected it to be this bad. From the moment he walked into the logistics floor, it was clear no one wanted him there. The dispatchers barely looked at him, the route planners whispered behind their screens, and the senior managers smirked when he walked by, like they were waiting for him to crash and burn. He could feel the challenge in the air. They wanted him to fail. Fine, let them watch. The first day, He sat with dispatch, watching how they assigned loads, how they handled delays. It didn't take long to see the cracks. Orders were backed up because the system had trucks waiting on inventory that was already sitting in the yard. Routes were overlapping, causing trucks to clog up the same highways instead of spreading out deliveries. And the worst part? No one cared. "This is just how it's done," one dispatcher muttered when Jake pointed out the obvious flaws. "Yeah?" Jake shot back. "And how's that working out for you?" By the second day, he was out in the yard, talking to the drivers themselves. That's where the real stories started spilling out. Long hauls with barely any rest stops, routes that made no sense, pay that didn't match the hours. "Management doesn't care about truckers," one guy said, shaking his head. "They sit up in that air-conditioned office making decisions that don't work out here in the real world." Jake clenched his jaw. He was management now, or at least that's what Eleanor was trying to turn him into, but he wasn't one of them. By the fourth day, he had mapped out a plan. It wasn't some fancy corporate overhaul. It was common sense. Spread out the load schedules. Let the drivers have a say in their own routes. Stop pushing overnight hauls through the cities at rush hour. Simple, but the executives hated it. "You're talking about reworking an entire system that's been in place for years," one of the managers said, crossing his arms. "Yeah," Jake shot back, "because it's broken." The tension crackled. He was making enemies. But he didn't care, because by the end of the week the delays were already dropping. And Eleanor? She was watching, and for the first time she looked like she believed he just might pull this off. By the time Jake stepped onto the warehouse floor, he already knew what he was up against. The boardroom was one thing, corporate sharks circling, waiting for him to slip up. But this was the heart of the operation. And it was a mess. Forklifts weaved through aisles stacked with half-sorted inventory. Pallets were crammed into corners, some marked incorrectly, others not marked at all. Workers moved like they were running in circles, checking and rechecking manifests that didn't match what was in front of them. Jake had spent years on the road waiting at docks just like this, listening to guys complain about lost shipments and backup delays. He had thought Caldwell Logistics was a top-tier operation. Looking at this disaster, he wondered how they got anything out the door on time. One of the supervisors approached, eyeing him warily. "Something I can help you with?" "Yeah," Jake said, nodding toward the congestion near the loading docks. "How long does it usually take to get trucks out of here?" The guy sighed. "Depends. Some days, a few hours. Other days we're backed up all night." Jake pointed toward a group of forklifts idling near a row of pallets. "Why are those just sitting there?" "Waiting on clearance from inventory management," the supervisor explained. "Nothing moves until they sign off." Jake frowned. He had heard this story before. Corporate efficiency on paper. Bottleneck disaster in reality. "Let me guess," he said. "Inventory's up in an office somewhere, buried under reports instead of down here where the actual work is happening." The supervisor hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." Jake exhaled, shaking his head. "That's the problem." Later that day, back in the conference room, the executives presented their so-called solution: more automation, more tracking software, more layers of corporate oversight. Jake sat through it, arms crossed, waiting for them to finish before finally speaking. "You're all trying to fix this with numbers," he said. "But this isn't a numbers problem. It's a people problem. You've got managers making decisions from a distance while the guys on the ground are stuck waiting for approvals that shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. One of the suits scoffed. "And your solution is what? Let the workers do whatever they want?" Jake leveled him with a stare. "No, my solution is to put decision-making where it belongs, on the damn warehouse floor." Silence. Then Eleanor spoke. "He's right." Every head turned. Jake just leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Now that was interesting. Eleanor watched Jake from across the room as he spoke with one of the warehouse supervisors, his hands moving as he explained something, his voice steady, confident. He didn't belong here, not in the way the others did, with their polished shoes and degrees hanging on their office walls. But somehow he commanded more respect in a few days than some of them had in years. She had seen it before, the way corporate men tried to talk their way into leadership, throwing around data and projections without ever understanding the people who actually made things happen. But Jake, he knew this world because he lived it. He had walked the warehouse floors, sat behind the wheel of a truck for endless miles, worked the kind of hours that bled a man dry. And yet, he didn't complain. He didn't demand recognition. He just did the work. She admired that, more than she wanted to admit. The executives had been pushing back against him all day, trying to poke holes in his ideas, trying to prove he didn't belong here. But the more they challenged him, the more she saw just how different he was. He didn't flinch under pressure. He didn't care about corporate games or empty titles. He just wanted the job done right. She had spent her career surrounded by men who wanted to impress her, men who smiled too easily, who said the right things, who studied her movements like she was another deal to be closed. But Jake had never once tried to win her over. If anything, he had treated her the same way he treated everyone else, with a quiet, steady resolve, unshaken by wealth or power. And it unsettled her, because for the first time in years, she found herself wanting to prove herself to someone else. She pushed the thought aside as Jake approached her, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Well," he asked, "think I pissed off enough of your suits today?" Eleanor let out a small laugh, surprising herself. "You've got them on edge." "Good," Jake said with a smirk. "They should be." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "So should I," she murmured under her breath. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure who was in control anymore. The tension in the office had shifted. Jake could feel it the second he walked in. The looks were different now, less dismissive, more watchful. The whispers weren't just curiosity anymore. They were something sharper. He wasn't stupid. He knew when he was being set up. For the last few days, he'd been grinding through the problems Eleanor had thrown at him. He had proven himself in the warehouse, streamlined the routes, even got some of the older truckers on board with the changes. But the better things got, the worse the energy around him became. And now, he knew why. Logan Pierce. The guy had been a shadow since Jake arrived, watching, waiting, always standing just close enough to hear, but never close enough to get his hands dirty. He was one of those corporate guys who had been around long enough to think he owned the place, someone who had built a career on shaking the right hands and keeping the right people on his side. And Jake was a problem. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" Logan said, stepping into his path as Jake headed toward the dispatch office. Jake stopped, meeting his gaze. The guy was slick, perfectly pressed suit, polished shoes, the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "I think I'm getting things done," Jake said. Logan chuckled, shaking his head. "Eleanor might be entertained by your little working-class hero act, but let's be honest, you don't belong here." Jake exhaled, his patience wearing thin. "That right?" Logan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think she's different? That she actually cares? She's using you, trucker, playing a game. And when she's done, you'll be right back where you started." Jake clenched his jaw. He knew guys like this, suits who built their lives on pushing others down. "Funny," Jake said, tilting his head. "You sound nervous." Logan's smile flickered, but he didn't drop it. "Careful," Logan said smoothly. "A man like you doesn't have much to lose. But me? I don't lose." Jake didn't blink. "We'll see about that." He walked past Logan, but he could feel it. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to be a fair fight. Jake didn't see it coming, not at first. He had been too focused on the work, too caught up in proving himself, in fixing the mess Caldwell Logistics had buried under spreadsheets and corporate arrogance. But he should have known. When men like Logan felt threatened, they didn't fight fair. It started with little things. Reports getting misplaced. Emails he never sent suddenly appearing in executives' inboxes with his name attached. Then came the meetings he was supposed to be in, meetings that got rescheduled at the last minute without anyone telling him. By the time he figured out what was happening, the damage had already started. Eleanor's face was unreadable as she stood behind her desk, arms crossed, watching him carefully. She had called him in without warning, her voice clipped, her usual confidence edged with something else. "Jake," she said, setting a thick folder down in front of him. "Tell me why I just got this report stating that you approved a reroute that cost us nearly $100,000 in lost efficiency." Jake frowned, flipping open the file. His name was right there, on a document he had never seen before, a signature at the bottom, one that almost looked like his, but not quite. His stomach turned. "This isn't mine," he said firmly, looking up at her. Eleanor held his gaze. "Then who did it?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He knew who. Logan. He didn't have proof yet, but the setup was too perfect. Logan had been waiting for a way to get rid of him, and now, somehow, there was paperwork tying Jake to a major screw-up. Eleanor tapped her fingers against the desk, watching him carefully. "I brought you in because I believed you saw things differently," she said. "But this is reckless." Jake clenched his fists. He had worked too hard, fought too many battles to let some snake in a suit take him down with a few falsified documents. "I didn't do this," he said, his voice low but firm. "And if you give me time, I'll prove it." Eleanor didn't answer right away. Then, finally, she nodded. "You have 24 hours. Jake swallowed hard. That was all he needed. Because if Logan thought he had won, he was dead wrong. Jake had been in tough situations before. He'd been stuck on icy roads with failing brakes, forced to haul loads that pushed his rig to the edge, and stared down more than a few men who thought they could push him around. But this? Standing in front of Eleanor, knowing his entire shot at something better was hanging by a thread, this was a different kind of pressure. The office was silent, except for the distant hum of the city outside. Eleanor stood near her desk, arms crossed, eyes locked onto him with a sharpness that made it clear she wasn't just listening, she was measuring him. "I want to believe you," she finally said, her voice even, controlled. "But this is serious, Jake. Falsifying approvals, making reckless decisions that cost this company money." She exhaled, shaking her head. "If I back you, and you're lying to me, I take the fall for it too." Jake felt that hit like a punch to the gut. He understood stakes, but this wasn't just about him anymore. "This isn't a mistake, Eleanor," he said, his voice steady. "It's a setup." She studied him, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Logan?" Jake nodded. "It's him or someone working for him. You knew he didn't want me here. This is how guys like him play the game. They don't fight fair. They don't argue face to face. They pull strings in the dark and let the damage take care of itself." Eleanor didn't flinch, but something shifted in her expression. Jake took a step forward, lowering his voice. "You brought me here because I see things differently, because I don't belong in this world. And that's exactly why they're trying to take me out, because they know I'm right." The silence stretched. Then Eleanor sighed, shaking her head. "You know what's funny?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "The first night I met you, I wasn't sure if I could trust you," she admitted. "Now I'm standing here, realizing you might be the only person in this entire building I can trust." Jake's chest tightened. "So," she said, straightening. "Prove it. Prove Logan's behind this." Jake smirked. "Already working on it." Jake had worked his whole life knowing that men like Logan always won. They sat in boardrooms, controlled the flow of money, and pulled the strings while guys like him broke their backs to keep everything running. It was the way the world worked, until someone decided to fight back. Eleanor wasn't backing down. She stood at the head of the long conference table, her expression calm, unreadable, but her presence alone was enough to silence the room. Around her, the executives sat stiffly, some checking their watches, others watching the scene unfold with veiled amusement. They thought this was just another meeting, another performance. Then she dropped the file onto the table. Logan barely reacted. If anything, his smirk deepened. "What's this?" Eleanor leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. "It's proof that you orchestrated a fraudulent report to discredit Jake." A ripple of tension moved through the room. Logan let out a breathy chuckle, shaking his head. "Come on, Eleanor. You're really going to take his word over mine?" Jake stayed quiet. This wasn't his fight anymore, it was hers. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "No, I'm taking the security logs, the internal email records, and the testimony of 3 employees who saw your assistant altering the documents over yours." Logan's face barely changed, but something in his eyes flickered. "I know you think you own this place," Eleanor continued, her voice level, controlled. "That you can twist the system to your advantage. But here's what you don't seem to understand. I own this place." The silence was suffocating. She turned to the rest of the table. Jake saw problems no one else in this company was willing to face. He fixed them. Meanwhile, Logan saw a threat and decided to sabotage him instead of doing his job. One of the board members, an older man with sharp eyes, cleared his throat. "This is a serious accusation." Eleanor didn't blink. "Which is why Logan will be resigning. Immediately." Logan's smirk was gone. His lips parted as if he was about to argue, but he must have seen something in Eleanor's expression that stopped him cold. He knew. It was over. Jake watched as Logan pushed back from his chair, adjusting his suit before turning toward the door. He didn't even look at Jake. Eleanor waited until the door closed behind him before speaking. "Any objections?" The room remained silent. "Good," she said. Then she turned to Jake. "You're staying." For the first time in his life, Jake realized maybe men like Logan didn't always win. The story spread faster than anyone could have predicted. What started as an internal conflict, a few executives trying to push Jake out, had morphed into something far bigger, a full-blown corporate scandal. When the leaked emails hit the internet, the entire company was exposed for its underhanded tactics, and Jake's name, once dragged through the mud, was now becoming synonymous with integrity and hard work. Eleanor had known it would get messy, but she hadn't realized just how many people were watching. The media picked up the story almost immediately, and soon Jake was everywhere, his face plastered across headlines, his name trending on social media. The story wasn't about a man who was accused of wrongdoing. It was about a man who had been wronged and had fought back with nothing but his dedication and honesty. Jake wasn't prepared for the attention. He had been working in silence, doing his job, fixing the issues no one else wanted to face. He never expected to be the hero. But that's exactly what he became. In the midst of it all, the messages started pouring in. Truckers, warehouse workers, and everyday people who had been stuck in their own miserable jobs, feeling overlooked and underappreciated, saw Jake's story as a spark. They saw a man who refused to back down, who fought for what was right, no matter the odds. A post went viral. "Jake's story is my story. I've been pushed down, lied to, told I wasn't enough, but I'm not giving up anymore." Jake sat in his truck one night, scrolling through the messages, his heart heavy with the realization that something he had never asked for had just changed his life and the lives of others. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It wasn't about fixing logistics or improving routes. It was about standing up, doing the right thing, and making sure others saw that it was possible to fight against the system, even when the odds were stacked against you. And as he read another message, this one from a young driver who had just started his first job, Jake realized something. They had won. He had become the symbol of hope he never knew the world needed, and for the first time he felt like he truly belonged, not just in the truck or at the company, but in a world that was finally starting to recognize the value of honest work and integrity. The boardroom felt different now. Jake could feel it the moment he walked in. There was an energy that hadn't been there before. The same polished faces, the same expensive suits, but the tension was gone. There was respect in the air now, not just skepticism. Eleanor was already sitting at the head of the table, her usual composure in place, but this time there was something more, something that made her seem even more untouchable, more powerful. She looked up as he entered, and for a brief moment their eyes locked. There was no need for words. She was ready. "Take a seat," she said, gesturing to the chair beside hers. Jake hesitated. This was it. He wasn't a corporate man. Hell, he never even wanted to be. He had spent his entire life driving across endless highways, working through the grime of warehouses and docks, surviving by his wits and his ability to fix problems others overlooked. But now, here he was, stepping into a world he didn't understand, not fully. He sat down, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. Eleanor didn't waste time. "I've been watching you, Jake, for a long time now. The way you handle problems, the way you lead from the ground up, not from some office miles away. You've done more in a few weeks than some of the people in this room have done in years." Jake shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with the attention. He wasn't used to being praised. He was used to working, fixing, getting things done without needing to be in the spotlight. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "You've proven you understand this company. And more importantly, you understand the people who make it run. The drivers, the warehouse workers, the ones who make sure the trucks get on the road. You see them for who they are, not as numbers on a report." Jake opened his mouth, ready to downplay it, but she held up her hand, silencing him. "I'm offering you a position, Jake, a leadership role. I want you to help me shape the future of this company. Not just the routes or the trucks, but the way we treat people, the way we lead." The room went silent. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. A part of him wanted to refuse, to walk away from the responsibility, from the pressure. But another part of him, one he had kept buried for so long, knew he couldn't turn this down. "You've got the job," Eleanor said, her voice firm, her eyes never leaving his. "If you want it." He swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling in. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'll take it." Jake stood in front of the open door to his truck, the engine still warm, the scent of diesel lingering in the air. He had spent countless hours in that seat, felt the weight of the miles pushing him forward, each town a fleeting stop, each highway an endless stretch of freedom and solitude. It had been his life for so long, his refuge, his escape from everything else that felt too complicated. But now, standing there, he couldn't help but feel the pull of something else. The leadership role Eleanor had offered him was no small thing. It was a chance to change the way things worked at Caldwell Logistics, to finally have a voice in the decisions that shaped the company, to stop fighting against a system that had always seen him as just another cog in the machine. It was everything he'd wanted, a chance to make a real difference, but it wasn't the life he had known. He ran his hand along the side of the truck, the metal cold beneath his fingertips. There was something comforting about the simplicity of it all. The road, the open space, the hum of the engine beneath him. It was a rhythm he understood, a pace he could control. The idea of stepping into a world of boardrooms, corporate meetings, and constant scrutiny felt like a foreign land. The thought of leaving it all behind was suffocating, but as he stood there staring at the truck, he realized something. The world he had been part of for so long, the life of a trucker, the long hours on the road, the constant grind, had always been his escape. But now he didn't need to escape anymore. He had the opportunity to do something bigger, something that mattered not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, overworked, or underappreciated. The drivers, the workers, the ones who had been treated as nothing more than a line item on a report. He could help change that. But what about the road? He closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the familiar sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the low rumble of passing trucks. He had spent his whole life on the move, but now, for the first time, he was standing at a crossroads, torn between the life he had known and the life he could build. With a final steadying breath, he made his decision. He turned away from the truck, his heart pounding, but there was a calm certainty in his chest. It was time. Jake gripped the steering wheel, the familiar hum of the truck beneath him, grounding him. The road stretched out before him, endless as always, the dark asphalt winding through the trees, illuminated only by his headlights and the occasional flicker of streetlights. The world felt quiet, almost peaceful, in a way it hadn't in a long time. This was it, his last trip. The decision had been made. He would leave the truck behind. He would walk away from the life that had defined him, from the open highways, the solitary nights, and the endless miles that had been his only constant. It was a choice that felt heavy, like a weight settling in his chest, but one that came with the certainty that something bigger was waiting for him. But that didn't mean he wasn't going to miss it. The road had been his refuge for so long. He had never needed anyone else, just the endless horizon, and the comfort of knowing that the next town was always just a few hours away. He had spent so much of his life behind the wheel, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to get attached. The life of a trucker had given him a sense of freedom. Freedom from expectations, freedom from anyone telling him what to do. As he passed a familiar diner on the side of the road, the glow of neon lights flickering in the distance, he couldn't help but think back to the long nights when he'd pulled in for coffee, shared a quiet word with the waitress, or sat at the counter in silence, just waiting for the next part of the journey to unfold. Those small moments, those quiet pieces of life, were what had kept him going all those years. But now, the road wasn't enough anymore. He had found something greater. He had found a place where his voice mattered, where the hard work he'd always put in had the chance to make a real difference. It wasn't just about delivering loads on time anymore. It was about delivering on promises, making sure the people who did the work got the respect they deserved. Jake took a deep breath, letting the night air fill his lungs. As much as he'd always been a part of the road had also been a part of him. But now he was ready for something more, something that didn't just take him from one place to the next, but took him forward. He had a future to build now, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. One last trip, one last time behind the wheel. Then he would turn the page. Jake sat across from Eleanor in the sleek conference room, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The offer she had made was everything he had ever wanted in some ways, a chance to lead, to reshape the company, to have a voice in a world he had always felt disconnected from. But it wasn't that simple. He knew himself too well, knew that walking away from the road entirely would feel like cutting a part of himself loose. The truck had been his life for so long, his refuge, his escape. He couldn't just let it go. Eleanor sat back in her chair, watching him closely, waiting. She knew this wasn't an easy decision for him. She understood the kind of man Jake was, the kind who built himself from the ground up, the kind who didn't need anything handed to him. She had seen him work, seen the way he made things happen without ever asking for credit. She had faith that he could take Caldwell Logistics to places it had never been. But she knew there was more to him than just a sharp mind for business. There was a fire in him, a part of him that wouldn't be satisfied by a desk and a title alone. "I'm offering you a chance to lead, Jake," Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm. "You could change the entire company, the way we treat people, the way we operate, the way we think." She paused, letting her words settle. "I believe you're the one who can do it." Jake leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. He didn't doubt her words. He knew the responsibility she was handing him. But something about it felt too big, too foreign. The idea of leaving behind everything he had known, everything that had kept him grounded, left a knot in his stomach. "I'll take the job," Jake said, finally meeting her gaze. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "But I'm not leaving my truck behind." Eleanor's eyebrows furrowed, a slight surprise flashing in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I'm still going to drive," Jake said, his voice calm but resolute. "I can't give that up. It's not just a job to me, Eleanor. It's who I am. I'll handle the office, handle the decisions, but the road is still where I belong." Eleanor studied him for a moment, weighing his words. She had expected him to dive in head first, to throw himself into the role without hesitation. But Jake was different. He wasn't looking to lose himself in the system. He wanted to change it, not become part of it. After a long pause, Eleanor nodded. "If that's what it takes for you to stay true to yourself, then we'll make it work." Jake nodded back, a weight lifting off his shoulders. He had his place in this world. He wasn't giving up the road, not completely. He would take the position, but he would carry his trucker roots with him every step of the way. No matter how high he climbed, he would never forget where he came from. And that, in the end, was the part that would make all the difference. Jake stood in front of the sleek glass doors of his new office building, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. His hand hovered over the door handle, but he paused for just a moment, his eyes drifting to the parking lot. It wasn't the polished, expensive cars parked there that caught his attention. It was the sight of his old truck, sitting there right at the edge of the lot. The rig he had spent years driving, the one that had carried him through the lonely nights, the long hauls, the countless miles. It was parked like it belonged, like it was a part of this world, even though the world he was stepping into now seemed so far removed from the life he had known. For a long moment, Jake just stood there, staring at the truck that had been his companion through thick and thin, the only thing that had never judged him, never asked for more than he was willing to give. He had made his way through the hardest days behind that wheel, learning everything he knew from the road, from the people he met along the way, from the quiet moments of reflection as the miles stretched out before him. And now here he was, walking into a shiny new office, sitting at a desk in a high-rise building with a title that came with power and responsibility. It was everything he'd ever wanted, in some ways, but it didn't feel like everything. It felt like a new chapter, a chapter that was still being written. Jake exhaled slowly, turning away from the truck and pushing open the door to the building. He had made it. There was no denying that, but as he stepped inside, he couldn't help but feel the pull of the road, the familiar hum of the engine calling to him, reminding him of who he was, where he came from. He walked down the hallway, past the polished floors and glass walls, and into his office, taking a moment to stand at the window. He could see the whole city spread out before him, the skyline glittering in the distance. This was where he was supposed to be. But the truck, the road, it would always be a part of him. It had to be. He glanced at his desk, the papers neatly stacked, the computer screen glowing with endless possibilities. It was a new beginning. But out there, parked in the lot, was a reminder of who he had been. And no matter how far he went, that man, the one who had built everything from the ground up, would never be far behind. Jake smiled to himself, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He had earned this. And no matter how high he climbed, no matter what new challenges came his way, he knew one thing for certain. He would never forget where it all began.